presentation in the office, so let's get started. We're going to do this in English because we're recording it. I want to talk a little bit about what it is to be a free software maintainer. I've been doing this for 37 years. Anybody here who's younger than 37, please raise your hand. Oh, we got a bunch of people. Okay, so I've been doing this for a long time. And along the way, besides doing professional software development and free software development, it's also enabled me to write books that are published with real publishers like O'Reilly and Prentice Hall. You can see I've given this talk a couple of times over the years. Of course, each time it's more years. And for this talk, I've actually gotten rid of a lot of. I'm assuming that most people don't really know Awk in great detail, so we'll just kind of hit the highlights. This is the agenda, history of Awk, how I got involved, and then the various stages of GNU Awk, as well as some of the things that have been happening to me in my life. So Awk was you can think of it as the first scripting language that really saw a lot of wide use. It was released with version 7 Unix in 1978. Up to that time, people wrote code mainly in Fortran, in the business world, in COBOL. C was starting to take off in universities with the spread of Unix. And Awk was sort of the first language that was a scripting language that was popular. It provided a lot of interesting things. The pattern action paradigm, where you just said, this is the data, this is what to do when you see it. A lot of the basic open a file, read something, test it, close the file, etc. All that stuff was handled for you, which was really nice. Regular expressions were a major part of the language. Associative arrays, which most people today call maps, was also part of the language, and that's a big key feature. It also was designed for data processing. It automatically split records into fields, automatically converted strings to numbers. Just very easy and simple to do, quick and dirty, but useful data processing, number crunching, or field rearranging kinds of things. There are also a few built-in string and math functions. So that was Awk. In the mid-'80s, the language started to see a lot of use. 1978 into the '80s, people were stretching the language, so the original creators decided to raise it up a level. They regularized the grammar, added some more string functions, allowed regular expressions to be the field separator instead of just a single space or a single colon or whatever. You can now delete array elements out of an array, gosh, who'd have thought? And the most important thing was user-defined functions, so that instead of having to write code in line all the time, you can actually define a function and call it, which at that point gives a lot more power to your language. This version was released in 1987. That's 9 years after the first version, with System 5 release 3.1. Come on, there we go. Let's back up a bit. Okay, and they published a book, and that's an important thing. Up to that time, there was a paper on Awk. I remember that I read it and went, wow, this is just like too weird, and I kind of ignored it. When the book came out, I said, oh, cool. And I got the book and I read the book and I said, oh, that's really neat. So how did I get involved? Well, in the early '80s, there was this thing called Usenet, which was based on UCP. Maybe there's a nice Wikipedia article, but people were able to post code, share code, post problems, get answers to their problems. It was a very open and distributed and friendly environment. By 1987, when the book was published, so I got the book and I read the book, and I said, gee, that's really cool. But it was proprietary software. You couldn't just FTP it from somewhere. I couldn't get it. Now, at that time, the GNU project had started, and they were trying to basically clone Unix, write Unix, at least at the user level, from scratch. All of the utilities, everything. So I said, let's go see if there's a GNU version of Awk. I'd like to play with it. At the time, I was single. I had a home Unix system. I had a lot of spare time, and I had a lot of interest in programming languages, which dated back already from college and graduate school. And something I want to point out, at the time, even today, I wasn't anybody special, right? I was just a 27-year-old guy who liked to hack on languages and C and Unix and stuff. And I got involved. I was able to get involved. So let's look at GNU Awk. At that time, the first version, written by Paul Rubin, Jay Finlayson, and Richard Stallman, it was a buggy clone. And it was a buggy clone of the old Awk. Buggy meaning memory leaks, language bugs. The semantics were wrong. And there was no documentation, not even a man page, nothing. There was a guy named David Truman who had volunteered to bring GNU Awk up to par with new Awk. So I got involved with him. We exchanged patches via email. Basically, we managed to get the original source tarball. And then we each worked with patches, sending patches back and forth to each other. Every once in a while, we would exchange a full tarball. This was all via UCP, which we did with telephones and modems. The internet was not universally available. Where I was, we actually had internet connection, but he didn't. So, and in fact, most of the Unix world at that time used UCP for email. Oh, I should have mentioned, let's, if there's questions, we'll do that at the end because there's a lot to cover here. And the folks on WebEx can send their questions in the chat and Adi will read the questions. Okay, moving on, there was version 2. Version 2, we added all the new features. We added many new features of our own, most of them small. And we started working with Brian Kernighan of Bell Labs. If you're familiar with the Kernighan and Ritchie C book, that's the same guy, the K, and that's the K in Awk. He was one of the 3 developers. And it's just amazing. Here's this guy, super smart, in the top of the ivory tower of research, emailing with little old me at my system administration job and taking me seriously. And to this day, he's a good friend. We got involved with the POSIX standard and started working on the documentation, the manual page, the tech info manual, and we started to get ports. The very first port was to MS-DOS. The next port was to VMS. VMS was very popular at the time, widely available. And so what's different? What's special about GNU Awk and GNU software? One of the main things is what's called no arbitrary limits. At the time, Unix programs, buffers were fixed. If you fed too much data into them, they just tended to roll over and die. And GNU programs were written with the idea that as long as I can get something out of the system, memory, CPU, or whatever, take it, use it, don't you have arbitrary limits. And that started to pay off. A guy named Rick Adams at a company called UUNet. And again, this is in the early 90s when systems were much, much smaller than they are today, used his Awk program for accounting. And he fed over 65,000 news articles through this single Awk program. And regular Awk just died, and GNU Awk kept on chugging. Also at this time, another version of Awk was released by a guy named Mike Brennan called Mawk. And if you're not familiar, Awk is AWK, Aho, Weinberger, and Kernighan. It's named after the 3 guys that created it. Michael just stuck the M in front to get Mawk. It just, and this kind of stays that way. Moving on, more new features, more ports. In 1993, I became the main maintainer. David Truman had sort of informally, when we both worked on code, but he did most of the code and I did mostly a lot of the documentation. He had to bow out, so I just took it up. Brian's NOC was released through something called NetLib, and then his webpage later on. And Awk starts to move into the mainstream because about this time is when GNU Linux and the BSDs start to appear and become popular. We'll talk about that on the next slide in a second. Version 3, we had more new features. We moved to something called AutoConf. And AutoConf solved a real problem. The problem is less visible today, but at the time, you had 85 million Unix vendors, and they each did something a little different. And in order to know, did I need to call index or stir-car or do this function or that function? It was very painful. And autoconf is a system that lets you write tests for the features that you want to use, and then you can build your code based on the results of that test. This was a lot of work, but it made things a lot easier in terms of maintenance going forward. We added more test suites, more tests to the test suite. And up until then, I'd been sort of mixing new features, bug fixes in patch releases or major releases. I decided that let's try to keep the major releases have the new features and just bug fixes in the patches. And in red here, stability continued to improve as users went up with GNU Linux and BSD. This is an important point because up till that time, if you had a Unix system, you typed ls, you typed awk, you used the system utilities that came with your Unix system. If you installed the GNU program, it sat alongside the others and you might have played with it, or you might have used it if you really needed it. But in general, nobody really beat on the program to make it work until it became the version of awk. With Linux, it was the version of awk. So people wanted to run their awk programs that they ported over from Unix or that they wanted to write because they'd learned it, and bugs started getting reported. And that's when things really, started to get solid. Also at the same time, the development slowed because I'd gotten married, started having kids. We moved to Israel, so things slowed down a little bit. You'll notice there's a trend here. We keep adding language features. We'll talk about that as we get a little bit later. One of the major things was statement count profiling. It's just one day I was bored. I said, let's add this feature where the idea was I could run a program on some data and then look at each line in the program and see how often it was executed. And the idea is that I can tell what's my hotspots, where am I spending all my time. So it wasn't CPU profiling, but it's still, I think, a useful thing, a useful information to have. Also, on the given dates here, we made the source code public. Initially, we were using CVS. In 2010, I moved to Git. Haven't looked back. Git is just light years ahead. And at that time, I took all the old versions that I just had copies of and moved them up to the public FTP site as well. Things continued to slow down. And then in the BSD world, they developed an allergy to the GPL license, so they moved over to Brian Kernahan's Awk. Okay, it's a free world. So for the past decade, a little bit more, things have been slowing down. There was a major change at 4.0, some very notable new features. Basically, a new developer had come on board and he decided that he really wanted to do a lot of stuff. We got real arrays of arrays, the ability to call a function indirectly, where you basically have a variable, give it the name of a function, and then say call through that variable to the real function. Rational range interpretation, maybe I'll explain that if anybody really cares, but it has to do with ranges in regular expressions. Made more sense now, begin end file patterns, many more things. The most important change is what we see here in red, was that the execution engine changed. Basically, the original version of Gawk up to this point built a parse tree. Parsed the program, you had a tree, and it recursively evaluated the tree for each line of input, each record of input. That worked just fine. It's a standard way to do things. This guy decided to replace that with a bytecode execution engine where basically you generated a linked list of codes, which then you go through in a loop and you run through. Speed was about the same, maybe a little bit faster, but what it gave us was a debugger. And I can now debug programs at the awk level, at the awk statement level, instead of trying to guess what's going on. Initially, there were 3 executables: regular Gawk, dgawk for debugging, and pgawk for profiling. Oh, we're okay on time. Good. The next version, we merged all three executables into one, which really is being nicer to your users. Instead of having to install three gigantic binaries, you only have to install one. There were some more language features. Was support for MPFR. MPFR is multi-precision floating point. Basically, it's the ability to do arbitrary precision floating point arithmetic. It's all done in software. It's pretty cool if you need it. In retrospect, it was probably a mistake to add it because nobody else does it. And it took a very long time to get MPFR programs in certain cases to be exactly the same as regular programs. Short and long options, we rationalized them. And then the next line, dynamic API was redone and documented. Basically, early on, somebody had donated some code so that I could load a shared object with some C code and call into it from an awk program. But it was very dependent on the internals of Gawk, which could change at any time, and it was never really documented. And I realized that it's the wrong way to go to keep adding language features into the language because it's more code, more things to support, document, etc. And this gives us extensibility. Anybody who wants to can read the manual and write their own code that calls out to arbitrary C code. So people, I think there are extensions for parsing XML, for parsing JSON, for dealing with databases. You can, once you have this ability, you can hook Gawk into just about anything. It hasn't really taken off, which is kind of sad, but at least it's there. And it's in 2014, the manual was revised very thoroughly, and it was published by O'Reilly. It says here again, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. You'll notice that as we go, fewer and fewer features. This is actually good. So a few more features, lots of, and then we added the ability in the Pretty Printer to preserve comments. The Pretty Printer, basically, I told you we've got this linked list representation of the program. What it did was go through that and reconstitute the program. So comments, they don't really exist at the syntactic level. They are the same as new lines. So it's a lot of work to preserve comments in the bytecode in order to be able to print it back out. Version 5, starting in 2019, the major feature was namespaces. Basically in Awk, your variables are all global, your functions are all global, and that makes software development in the large harder. And coming from a software development in the large background, familiar with C++ and so on, I was looking for a way to provide namespaces where I could have two functions named foobar, and they could coexist in the same awk program. The ability to have libraries and so on and so forth. The other interesting thing is persistent memory. Persistent memory means I can run an awk program and the state is saved off to a file in disk, and then I can run again and that gives me that same state back. I can do something else. It's essentially, if you're familiar with the term, a read eval print loop, but it's for free. I just say gawk something else, and it keeps loading the memory, updating it, storing it back. This has seen a little bit of use, not a lot, but it's also kind of cool and wasn't too hard to slip in to the code. The other major thing was support for new features in Awk. So we've been talking about Gawk. What's going on in the rest of the world? So back in Awk land, here's what's going on. First of all, Brian Kernan put his code up on GitHub. That makes it instantly available to the world. And he was still doing stuff with it, but on a very low level, very infrequently. In August of 2018, I finally said, please, can I have access to the repo? There are bugs that just got to get fixed because these were things that people were complaining about that worked in Gawk, worked in some of the other versions, didn't work in his. And he gave me write access. And eventually I actually was the active maintainer for about 2 years. Um, that was overwhelming, trying to maintain two versions of the same program, basically. And in December of 2020, a guy named Ozan Yigit took over as the maintainer. I still do stuff, but he's responsible now, which helps. In 2022, what happens is every year Brian Kernighan goes on vacation. He goes to England and he writes a book or he does something else. He decided that he wanted to add more features to his Awk. In particular, he added support for comma-separated value files, which is something that people always want to be able to do with Awk, and it never quite worked. He decided to make it work. He also added support for Unicode, which is hardwired. Awk supports Unicode and any other character set that your underlying C library supports. And there was the \USK sequence, so you could actually specify a Unicode code point. And he decided to update the book. In a lot of ways, that's the major event here. He put a lot of work into the book, and then I put in a lot of work to review the book and finally bring it up to standard. So now, what about all this publishing stuff? Well, the truth is I've always been, in certain ways, better or more easily able to write than to do math. And so I was trying to get paid for writing. And first I started working with a company named SSC. They're no longer around, but they published these Unix reference cards. So I did one for them on the Corn shell. And I was trying to get the Gawk manual published, but the permissions said from the owner of the copyright, which was the Free Software Foundation, they said, anybody can copy this. You know, you can just take it, photocopy it. And your regular old book publisher, that they're allergic to that, right? Badly allergic to that. So nothing happened. In 1984, SSC started Linux Journal, which you may have heard of. I wrote a few articles. Finally, in 1996, SSC said, hey, we'll take a chance. And they actually published it as a real book. About that time, O'Reilly wasn't interested. They had a book called Set in Awk, famous book. They didn't want to replace the Awk part with the Gawk manual, but it really needed updating. And I volunteered to do that because it really, really needed updating. So the second edition came out in 1997, and big surprise here, I got a really big royalty check. I really wasn't expecting that. And again, in 1997, you didn't go to the internet to look for information. You bought a book, and books weren't online. And so at that time, it was a lot of dollars. It was like, whoa, okay. And it was really very unexpected. So what happened? I knew I was going to move to Israel, and I knew I wasn't going to go to work right away. So I said, okay, I'll do some more books, and maybe I'll make some money. And in particular, after getting here, working on these books and looking for jobs, and this is 1997, startup companies weren't as smart as they are today. They all wanted 60 to 80-hour work weeks. And I'd already done that in the States, not once, but twice. So I said, heck, I'm making money writing. Maybe I'll just do this full time and I'll keep updating books. So I did a number of books, the Gawk manual in 2001, and as we mentioned in 2014, books on VI and Vim, shell programming, pocket references. In 2004, Prentice Hall came to me and said, hey, you're a good author. You want to write a book for us? And so I said, I'll write a book on basic Linux programming, which I did, and which I'm actually revising at the moment. So that worked for quite a while, basically until the first internet bubble burst. And then in 2005, early 2005, I had to go find a day job. But 7 years that I set my own schedule, made quite enough money to support the family. We built a house, not too bad. So I do continue to write. I've updated some of the books. If you put Arnold Robbins into Amazon.com, you'll get a list. But I've been mostly working as a software engineer, initially at Nest TSG, Intel and McAfee for 10 years between them, Scotafence, which is a startup company, which was recently bought by Honeywell, and here at Guardicore. And then next up is retirement. I finally decided, okay, had enough, 41 years, time to just pack it in. So what have I learned about cloning a Unix program? So Brian, we refer to parts of the language as dark corners where it's not really defined. What's really going to happen here? So he's always got a pithy quote. He said, dark corners are fractal. No matter how much you eliminate, there's always a smaller one, but a darker one. And that's true. Basically, good documentation isn't enough. The original book didn't give us all the details. And sometimes you say, well, let's just go see what the program does. And what the program does is really wrong. You know, and you say, Brian, is it really supposed to do that? And he's like, no, it's really not supposed to do that. There were lots of dark corners. And the current manual, the Gawk manual, lists about 40 of them. There are also brainos, where you have a function named foo with a parameter named foo. And you say, C equals foo. Well, is that a function call? Is that a variable assignment? What's going on? So we got basically infinite recursion and a core dump. This was very long ago, but it's long since been fixed. But there were a number of these things. And sometimes if the original language was not done as well as it could have been, you can't just fix it because there's code out there that uses it the way it is. What else? No one reads the documentation. I've put a huge amount of time into the manual. People still ask questions that if they went to the manual, they'd see the answer. More important is be careful of creeping featureism. It's really, really, really easy to add more features. It's a lot of fun. It's sexy. It's neat. It's cool. It's exciting. It's like, look what I'm doing that they didn't do. But sometimes it's hard to get right. It's very hard to remove bad ideas. If something in retrospect really was a bad idea, it's too late. You've got portability and compatibility issues where I can do something, but the other versions can't. Sometimes that matters, sometimes it doesn't. And I think there's a big thing here, which you can't really see on the screen, but the code base just grows a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, until all of a sudden, it's really too hard and too big to maintain well. And it's been that way for quite a while, actually. So the idea is that the extension API should handle that instead of my having to add features. And I think there's a lot of neat features just people haven't used. The biggest example of that is that you can actually translate strings into your native language just like you can with C code. I've never, ever, ever gotten a bug report on that feature, and it's got to be well over 20 years old. So I just think nobody bothers to do it. So Awk really wasn't designed for extensibility. And also you really got to test and test and test and test very carefully. There were 2 versions when I had a per record memory leak, and that's just nasty. So you got to be careful. The other thing is being a BDFL, the benevolent dictator for life, which is a term that was coined by Guido van Rossum for Python, which means you're the guy in charge and you make the decisions and forever. And of course, I really didn't think I would still be doing this 37 years later. I got involved, it was fun. But at the time, if you said, will you be doing this 37 years from now? I'd have said, of course not. You also have to be careful not to let it consume all your time. You got to have a life, a wife, a kids, or husband and kids, a family away from the computer. There are people out there that think you work for them. It's free software, so you work for me, right? You know, you need to do this and you need to do it right away. And of course, what I want you to do is exactly what needs to be done. And why didn't you do it 5 years ago? That kind of thing. There's also the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically says people who are amateurs don't really understand how amateurish they are. And that people who are professionals and really good at something underestimate how good they are. So I've given it a rather pessimistic twist, which is that idiots don't know that they're idiots. And sometimes you just got to deal with them or figure out how to get them off your back. An unfortunate corollary, which has showed up more recently, is that a-holes can't be made to understand that they're a-holes. And you just also got to kind of try to get them off your back. Toxic narcissists. We really only had one of those, but boy, this guy was terrible. On the other hand, the fan mail keeps me going, which is really nice. And sometimes contributors just come out of the woodwork. People you've never seen before, talked to before, say, hey, here's this problem, here's a patch. Hey, here's a bug, here's a fix, here's something. Or can I do something? I want to do something. And that's wonderful. I mean, there's a guy who's been on the project for a number of years now, totally came out of the woodwork, but he knows the code, says, well, when you made this fix, what about this thing down here? Did you think about that? And it's like, no, I didn't think about that. You're right. And so he kind of keeps me straight. Came out of the woodwork. One day just, started submitting patches and stuff. And that's also wonderful. I mean, I'm doing this. I'm the maintainer. I'm the one that makes the releases. But I do have a team of people that do ports and do testing and do other things. So how has this helped me personally? Well, I like the fan mail, as I mentioned. It's let me meet and become friends with famous people, or less famous, but Brian Kernan, as I mentioned. Mike Brent, or often Mark, excuse me. He lived in Seattle. My wife was from Seattle. And so the light bulb went on. And I said, hey, I'm going to be in Seattle. Why don't we meet? And we got together. We talked technical stuff and whatever. We became friends. Richard Stallman, initially, the guy who founded the GNU project, some interaction, very little today. But I would say I'm friends with several other GNU maintainers, either via email or in person. Notably, there's a guy named Eli Zaretsky who's here in Israel. He's a maintainer of GNU Emacs these days, and he and I have been working together over 30 years or so. And a big thing here, doing my part for Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam is the Jewish idea of making the world better. And I don't want to sound like I'm boasting, but I think this is a contribution to making the world better. Free software and my part in it really have made a big difference in the world. And that's when I stop to think about it, that's a good feeling. Professionally, well, I spent a number of years as an author and contract programmer, and it sure beat 80-hour work weeks and 2-hour commutes. The O'Reilly work was a direct result of my being the Awk maintainer. So that's directly how I got into publishing. There's a book called Unix in a Nutshell, which in the 90s and early 2000s was very famous. I'd have never thought my name would be on that book, but it is. Working with Mike Brennan led to some contract programming. Prentice Hall came to me because I was an O'Reilly author, and Eli Zaretsky, who I just mentioned, helped me get the job at Nest when I needed to go to work. And then in July of this year, out of the blue, big surprise, the Usenix Association gave me their Lifetime Achievement Award. Totally unexpected, but that's a really major thing. What's the Awk world like now? Well, so the original Awk is available on GitHub. The BSDs use it. There's a POSIX standard for it, and that's not true of any other scripting language except for the shell. There's no standard for Perl. There's no standard for Ruby. There's no standard for Python, right? I mean, there's all these projects, they do it, but there's no formal standard for these languages. Not all implementations are POSIX compliant. That's okay. There's a lot of other Awk implementations. Mock, there's a version in Go, the one from Open Solaris, originally from a company called MKS, BusyBox Awk, one called Whack. This guy said, I want to write an Awk implementation, but I've run out of names. So he just permuted the letters. That's fairly recent. There are links to all of these in the Gawk manual. Gawk has the most features, and it's standard in many of the Linux distributions. And people also, it's interesting. Occasionally I get these emails like, yeah, I was using, what's the fancy Google thing for doing distributed big data processing? What's that called? Yeah, whatever, I forgot. But in any case, I've had people tell me, just running all my stuff through Awk is faster than the fancy distributed, whatever it is, I forgot. Let's sum up a little bit. Initially, work focused on compatibility and performance, then compliance with the standard, which meant getting the standard itself correct. I submitted a ton of reports initially, helping the other Awks out. Feeping creatureism, where things are just keep growing and keep growing. They shouldn't be. I'm doing a lot better these days, but adding features is very addictive, particularly when you haven't learned that lesson yet. Having new blood come along is good. This guy who did the bytecode and arrays of arrays and MPFR was somebody else. It wasn't me. And he just wanted to do that. Making the source public was a good idea. Doing free software is fun and important, and that's a big thing. So for all of you young whippersnappers out there, particularly out in WebEx land, think about it. All of today's internet and computing infrastructure, just about all of it is based on free software. Linux, GNU stuff. Get involved. Everybody's got talent. When I got involved, I wasn't anybody special. Software changes and grows. The people who've been doing this for a long time are getting older. They want to retire. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, it's all in C. Yeah. So what? You can learn C. You're smart. Study it. Go for it. Find a free software project that you're interested in and contribute to it. It's a way to give back the things that you've been benefiting from probably for a very long time. And I think that's it. Questions and answers. Oh, come on. No questions? We have questions in the chat?
Just for the compliment.
All right. How easy was it to develop and maintain Awk back then? The code was plain C without object orientation. So that's the first question. Object oriented wasn't a big deal back then. Everybody was writing plain C. The code was a lot smaller also. And this is another bit of nostalgia. What I did was print out all the source on fanfold paper, 8.5 by 11 by 17 fanfold paper, where you can, move the paper and write on it and make notes and flip back and forth to refer from one part of the program to the other. That's how I learned the code. And then again, it was incremental changes. There wasn't, one change at a time, one thing at a time. This was not hard. And how did I manage bug fixes and feature requests? And was it part of the Usenet systems? I'm not sure I understand that question, but basically it's all managed on a mailing list. People submitted bug reports and we would figure it out and reply with a patch and then put the patch into the code. Feature requests, basically the same thing. If a feature made sense, I'd put it in. I wish I'd been a little bit more discerning it over the years, but it took me a while to realize that when people say, Gawk really needs XYZ, that what they meant was, I really want XYZ. Not necessarily that it was really good for the language as a whole. And so basically the code grew and I made releases as I made releases. And then when the source code repos were put up, anybody could just get it and get the most recent code instead of having to wait for me. Okay. What's my opinion on how AI, ChatGPT, affects the future? I assume you mean the future of development. In particular, I don't need to read awk books anymore, but ask, this is what I want, give me an awk command for that. Personally, I think it's a bad idea because, first of all, the time or two that I've asked ChatGPT for code, I've gotten bad code. Second of all, it means you're doing something without understanding what you're doing. And you're relying on machine-generated code, and maybe it's really right, and maybe it's subtly wrong. You look at it, okay, it looks right, and you plop it in, and you run a few tests, and it seems to do the thing. And then you put it into production, and it breaks in 3 months, and you don't know what happened, or you're gone, and somebody else has to figure it out. I'm very old school. I really think people should understand how to write code, what the code is doing, and what they're doing, instead of relying on AI. And I think that personally, I think it's a bad trend, but that's the way it goes. Okay, going once, twice.
When you moved to Israel, did you find it as a setback in work?
When I moved to Israel, did I find it a setback on my work? In other words,
When you were in the US, everything was much closer to each other. You were closer to other maintainers and other users.
so did it affect my work as a maintainer? No, because it was all email. I mean, it wasn't chat or video calls. I mean, so yeah, there's a time difference, and occasionally that's a bit of a hassle. But just being here because it's all email, and it just didn't make any difference. Okay.
God asked you, did you have any contact with the FreeBSD Awk maintainers?
Did I have contact with the FreeBSD Awk maintainers? When I was maintaining Brian Kernahan's Awk, yes. Basically, they'd submit issues in GitHub. I made an effort. What I did basically was collect the code from the other BSDs and make a branch that was the BSD features. And so I tried to unify into one branch the various features that were in the different BSDs so that they could all use that version. Isn't that how things work now? People are main source of errors. I guess that's in relation to the chat GPT question. So yeah, but if you write the code, then you have a better chance of figuring out what you did wrong. And that looks then, so my compliments, very neat stuff. I read the first Linux in a nutshell book. Thank you. Yeah, they took a bunch of stuff from Unix in a nutshell for that. They didn't pay me anything, but they put my name on the cover. Have you seen some use of Awk that was a surprise to you? Like some techniques the community invented and wasn't designed internally? Yeah. It doesn't work anymore, but somebody wrote a YouTube downloader in Awk to download videos from YouTube. So there are some things that people do that are weird. It's like, great. Hey. Any other questions? Okay, so I think we will call this an end, and you can stop recording. Thank you, everybody.